Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Global Peoria. This is our bi-monthly discussion of the hottest topics in the news with an expert who is willing to explore that topic a little more fully for us participants. Tonight, Shelley is going to take it away and introduce our speaker.
Hello all, glad you're all here and healthy. I hate to rub it in, but I'm calling in again from sunny Florida. I understand it was cold and snowy up there, but I will be returning on Sunday, so never fear. I'm sure it will get warmer. I also want to give a special greetings to our friends from the Peoria Jewish Federation who have been invited to join us. Hopefully they have a good crew along. Tonight we're going to talk about Israel's response to COVID. It's been in the news quite a bit in the last week or two, and I think you'll find out why as we go along. Our guest is Daniel Ashheim. I think I didn't butcher that too much. Daniel, he said I can call him that, is a native of Jerusalem. He's currently serving as a counsel for public diplomacy in Chicago, and his portfolio in the Midwest includes media, culture, and academics. He can add to that PAWAC. He just moved to Chicago this fall, so he hasn't lived a full year. We haven't explored whether he'll become a Cubs fan or a Sox fan, but we can work on that. But he was previously stationed in Senegal in West Africa. And his other experience in the military, as you know, everyone in Israel needs to serve. He was in intelligence. But my favorite thing in his resume is he was a concierge at the King David Hotel, which is a historic site, which I hope to visit. So welcome, Daniel, to our group.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation, Shelley.
This should be fun. So first, tell us, what is the status in Israel vis-a-vis COVID, and how hard has it hit?
You're getting right to business. So first of all, I will say good evening, Erev Tov, and I'm sorry it's in these black cubes, but that's the way we are living. And I really hope that this question would be behind us next year. We'll remember this historic thing called COVID that once happened, and it will be a far away, distant memory. We'll all be healthy. That's the most important before we get into the topics. So just to give you, as for your question, I would like to start by giving a little bit of numbers. We have to start with numbers. We see these graphs to understand just the basic idea of where we are standing now. So Israel is actually in a crossroad. On the one hand, we are seeing the leading country in the world in the pace of vaccinations per capita. So we are seeing numbers which are extraordinary. So also they started vaccinating the elderly population, the crews, the medical crews, and it went more and more towards the rest of the population. We are talking now, as of yesterday, people the ages of 35 and up can be vaccinated without waiting in line. They just called to get vaccinated. We have, as for this moment, we have out of the 9 million people living in Israel, we have 2,927,000 people vaccinated. So we are in very high numbers, and we need to remember that people under the age of 16 are not getting vaccinated because this was not approved by FDA. We still have populations that are a bit more challenging, for maybe have allergies. So we are talking from the eligible population that it was open. We have very, very high numbers. We are talking about the population of 80 and up. We are talking about approximately 85% already vaccinated. We have some challenges connected to other populations. I'm going to get to that in a moment if it interests you. What are the challenges? But this is the number of people vaccinated. And this is an incredible operation, and it has a few reasons for it. One is connected to the Israeli government's understanding in the beginning that if we want to get out of this thing, we have to get vaccines. This is the only way out, the only light in the tunnel. And this is really a personal efforts that were made by the Minister of Health, by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the rest of the government in order to get it as quickly as possible, as many vaccinations as possible from Moderna, from Pfizer, developing in Israel vaccinations, AstraZeneca in the future. But the most important was getting the vaccinations and getting them now. That was number one. Number two is from the system of the Israeli medical care, which is a very unique system in the world. So besides having a very good public medicine centers and hospitals and more, we have a system of kupot cholim, it's called, which are medical care providers that every citizen by law has to be assigned to one of these four. And therefore, they are your mothers and fathers for anything connected to healthcare. So it's like I would compare it to a McDonald's, a Walgreens, a Starbucks. You are a member of one. You can go to branches all over the country of the same firm, of the same medical care, and then you can get the service. You have your medical card, and it's valid for around the country. So this mechanism that is already escorting Israelis since 1948 is one of the triggers for why it's so effective today. So this is as of the vaccinations. Now, parallel to that, Shelley, you asked, what is the status? So if I say that, I would assume that I could say only optimistic news. We're in the end of COVID. Nevertheless, unfortunately, we're experiencing, despite being in a closure for 3 weeks now, for real closure in Israel. So things are shut down. Most of the things are shut down. Restaurants are closed, shops are closed, schools are closed. We're still seeing very, very high numbers. And as of today, we have more and more people who are sick, more people in severe intensive care. It's getting a little bit down in the recent few days, but really minorly. And we were expecting it. If we look at the second closure and the first closure, we saw completely different numbers. The numbers went down dramatically. And they claim that because of the British mutation, some of the South African mutation, the Brazilian still hasn't arrived, thank God. California, there are a lot of mutations. They don't really know. Bottom line, they don't really know how to explain why the numbers are not going down. And this is a very problematic factor.
That raises the question, we have seen in this country that the disease, the virus spreads when we don't social distance. We go out and we interact with people because the virus, was that the same problem in Israel, that people were not, they thought they were over this, before the vaccine, but also in the beginning phases, that folks were not heeding the medical warnings?
So it's a complicated question because Israel, I'm bringing you back. I was still in Senegal. I'm not going to give you where I was. My wife was pregnant. She was 8 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant in the midst of COVID. The borders of Senegal were closing down. We were not allowed to deliver in Senegal because of the medical conditions there in general. My wife was traveling to Germany. They closed the borders there. We were both on the way to Israel. The world was actually stopping. And we came to Israel, and it was the beginning. You can see here, if she's behind me with the baby, so it's worthwhile seeing if she's already here. So this was very important to mention. Here, this is Ella, my baby.
Hi, Ella.
This is Elisa, my wife. So,
Chicago.
Beautiful thing behind me was born in Israel in May. But when we came in March, this was when COVID began, and Israel was actually one of the first countries in the world to acknowledge that this is coming to us. And this is not only those Chinese who are far away people, and then these Italians, we didn't understand what that means, but rather they closed most of the airlines, most of the flights from Israel were shut down. People were called in Passover that year, a year ago Passover. People were called to stay home completely. We were not allowed to move more than 200 yards away, 200 feet away from the house, and we were there. It was.
So I know in other countries, and not only authoritarian countries, but Australia, for instance, that had hard lockdowns, there were police on the street, and if you ventured outside without a notice, a doctor's office or whatever, you got a substantial fine.
The same in Israel. The same in Israel. It was illegal. There were police. We came in, we were 2 weeks in quarantine. We got 4 times checked by the police to see that we're in the house when we arrived to Israel. And we were diplomatic passports, and 4 times we got random checks to see if we're in the house. When you leave the house without a mask, it was not in March, but it took a while. You get a fine of 500 shekels, which is about $150 US. If you violate the closure, if you open your shop, you get 5,000 shekel fine, which is now probably going to be doubled as of tomorrow. This means
Was mask wearing mandatory?
in the beginning, it was not. In the beginning, this was also an issue. The Ministry of Health said it's not necessary, and then they changed it completely, and they said it's mandatory. And since then, it's already escorting us from April. It's mandatory April last year, mandatory in the whole country with fines, and everything is with fines and a lot of police on the streets. And with the Shin Bet, our FBI is also monitoring the phones to see who is leaving the place when they need to be in quarantine. And nevertheless, with all these steps, and this is to answer your question, Shelley, it's still a mystery why the numbers are still high with the closures, with police on the streets, with fines, and with people understanding the situation, the delicate situation. There are those, and this is important to address, and being fairly open about this, there are groups in Israeli society that are more challenging, and most of them are in the ultra-Orthodox extreme factors inside the most of them, the mainstream ultra-Orthodox are following the rules. Nevertheless, we have groups there who are having 40%, we have 40% positivity rates in Bnei Brak, which is the ultra-Orthodox city, which is a huge number. Tel Aviv, 3%, 40% we see in Bnei Brak, which is a city next to a city. And nevertheless, when we see these problems, then they are the ones who are keeping open some of their schools when all the others are closed. So this is kind of a difficult thing, but it's not only a COVID issue. This is a challenge for Israeli society. It just exploded now in COVID more. These were things that were always existing, and now they are getting more and more in public debate, and it's getting really in the elections now. This is going
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you about that. Before I do, I would just remind everyone on the call, if you want to ask questions in the chat function, please do so. So far, we don't have any, but we will get to them. That's the way to communicate. Ask your questions, type them in the chat function, and we'll get to them when we have a moment. So, Daniel, you talked about the ultra-Orthodox, and in my reading, they are an independent source. They're kind of anti-government. They don't necessarily follow the rules, but they are also strong allies of your government, of Netanyahu, and he doesn't want to do anything to alienate them. So there's a political component to that. Imagine that, COVID being considered in politics. Who would ever thought that would happen? So the question is, what is being done to get those folks who are not complying, the ultra-Orthodox, we would call them something else in this country, far right, to get them to comply, because they endanger everyone?
I'll start by saying that this COVID is a real pain in the place that we all know where it means, but it really is a challenge for the world. And this is something I'm saying truly because it's painful for me to see the reality. I'm looking all over the world. I'm looking what's happening in the United States, in Europe, in the most advanced economy countries in the world. What is happening to society? And in America, you can see it became a discussion, wearing masks. Are you Republican? Are you Democrat? It's also becoming an issue of politics where it should completely be out of politics. And it's the same thing that you see in certain groups. The fact that you need to send police to close schools, and the fight is over education, whether you're closing a synagogue or not. I mean, it's a tragedy. Think about the situation. It's a surreal situation that Israeli Jewish police are getting into synagogues and arresting people and giving fines to people who the only thing they're doing is coming to learn the Torah. They're not going there to spread diseases. This is something, this concept we tend to forget because we watch the news and we see a violation because of a wedding there. The Arab population did a wedding, so we're accusing them. Why are they celebrating there? The other ones are studying, and it really is annoying because we see that this is causing more and more people getting or sick. Nevertheless, we do need to remember that in the end, the people are not doing it because they want to spread the disease, but it's really a problematic thing, and it's a clash between beliefs. And here we had the things. In the beginning, we saw there were demonstrations every Saturday night in front of the Prime Minister's house in Jerusalem, claiming that Netanyahu needs to leave office. And on the other hand, there were synagogues and people praying. And then they started closing synagogues because of COVID restrictions, but because democracy is above, you need to allow demonstrations. So then the ultra-Orthodox said, what do you mean? What is this value? Why is demonstrating above the value of study learning? Life happens because we study the Torah. You don't understand. The world will collapse if we do not study Torah in shuls. So it's a much more complex question than rather, what are you for politically? What do you vote for? It's a clash of civilizations. It really is. Whether you open a cultural institution or you close a mikveh. These are dilemmas that we never faced before and we are facing now. And just to complete the answer, as for the political allies, we need to differentiate, and it is a problem differentiating sometimes, between the ultra-Orthodox representation in government, between the Sephardic, the Ashkenazim, and inside them, they're also very, very complex. Inside the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, Yahadut HaTorah, there are several different factors there. And there are those who follow the more extreme, the more moderate, those who are complying with all the regulations of the government, and therefore it makes it even more complicated. And we are in the end forming coalition governments, and that's coalition. That's the problem of forming coalition governments.
So you talked about synagogues. Were synagogues ordered closed or were they open?
They were, most of the time they were closed or restricted to outside prayers, up to 10, 20 people in capsules outside with masks. Then they were closed, then they were open.
But was that, when during that closure,
Closed.
did they follow the rules? Because obviously we had situations here where churches were supposed to be closed and some folks disregarded that. But we also had, I remember seeing stories in New York, some ultra-Orthodox Jews having huge gatherings. And obviously, you can say that wasn't their intent, but those are super spreader events. They just are.
So I watch the news every day. So I watch Israeli news, I watch local news, I read newspapers. The first thing you see every day are violations of the curfews. So you see a wedding here, you see a synagogue open there, you see a school open there, and it's repeated. Of course, you never see the vast majority of the population that do follow the rules. So you see the violation, it's very hard to get proportions of how many people are actually violating the rules, because most people are living their lives and following the rules and going according to what is asked for. And the reason now the numbers are so high are less because of the violation. It's true. The violations, of course, cause more, there's no doubt. The more you violate, the more numbers are there. But it's also the fact in the ultra-Orthodox communities, as I mentioned before, 40% positivity rate. We need to remember that when you are living 10 people in a one-bedroom apartment in Bnei Brak, and you are locked down inside, the chances of you, if one person carries the COVID, the whole family will have COVID, and one person goes out to buy groceries, another 10 people will get it. So this automatically you see higher numbers in these communities. But the fact that there are violations, true. There are more violations in certain communities, true. Nevertheless, they are saying that now the main reason is the British mutation that is causing these numbers.
Let me shift gears a little bit. I understand that Israel has made a contract or an arrangement with one or some more of the drug manufacturers to get the supply, and in return, they will share their medical information of how successful it is and in which. Could you kind of elaborate and inform our folks on the call about that quite unique arrangement?
Yes, so I will say what is published, because some of the agreements are always a bit more confidential because of business terms. These are eventually the vaccination companies are businesses and they do not publish it. It's not all details are completely clear, but from what the Ministry of Health published.
We won't tell anyone, Daniel, it's okay.
It's between me and you.
Absolutely.
We'll keep it there. So Israel signed agreements with most of the providers before. The minute they started producing or developing it, Israel signed with Moderna. They were the first to sign with Moderna, and actually one of the last to sign with Pfizer, which is interesting. Nevertheless, in the agreement that we see published recently, they said that you need to send to Israel high numbers, high volumes of shipments of vaccinations. And in return, Israel, because of what I mentioned at the beginning, because of its very efficient medical system, and the fact that we are 9 million people, very small country, we can show that we will be able to be the pilot country in the world to be fully vaccinated and to get to herd immunity in practice. And therefore, this is the number one interest of the companies. Eventually, every company wants to show their success. And if you start with a huge country, it will take you a long time until you see results. And if you start in a small country that's efficient, knows what they want, and in Israel, they do not waste one vaccination a day. They see in the beginning of the day, the number of people expected to come and get the vaccination. They see there'll be a gap of 100 because you need to throw it because of the freezing. Then they invite people, they send them messages, they tell them come and get vaccinated, even if they're not in the age group. So in order not to waste. So they see that there's no waste of vaccinations. And of course, and what Israel is giving is not personal medical information, but rather general in the macro level, is giving the amount of people who are treated, the amount of people who got the vaccine, if we see side effects which were not seen before. Eventually, the Pfizer experiments had between 30,000 to 70,000 people total in the world before it was FDA approved. Now we are talking about 3 million people already had this. Not all had the second phase of the vaccination, but we are talking about huge numbers here. So if it will be a success in Israel, it's going to be a success in the world. And I hope this is going to be the case. I don't want to talk about failures because we are Jews, we need to be optimistic.
And in fact, the early reports seem to indicate great success with the vaccination and being effective in Israel. Is that correct? That's the latest thing I just saw.
So the statistics, we are seeing different research coming from these medical suppliers and from the Ministry of Health. Most of these reports claim that they see after following the second vaccination, they see a very good success rate of very low rates of people that got it. So we're talking about 0.01% of people who have COVID after their second round. Nevertheless, these are still initial. We cannot guarantee this until we see the numbers in total, and we see eventually that we see the numbers going down. And we need to start seeing them in the next 2 weeks because this is the numbers are a bit alarming. We do not like to see the number of people who are in severe conditions still high as is now.
Okay, here's what I really want to drill down in, because everyone on this call, virtually everyone in America, is struggling with getting the vaccination, or a friend who needs the vaccination, how to go about it. And most indications are the initial rollout in late December and early January was not the best. And so I want to know, what did the Israeli government do? What was the process? If I'm a retired guy in Israel or a working guy, how did I get the vaccine? How was that done?
Okay, so it's a very, very efficient and very effective system. And I will give you a few words because it is important to understand what I mentioned in the beginning with the system. It's important to understand. Daniel, when I was born, my parents said, I'm a member of 1, 2, 3, 4. There were 4 options, which medical supply you want to go to. And remember, this is not which medical insurance you have, like you have in America, United Healthcare. It's not the same thing. It's your provider. So I chose, my provider is called Meuchedet. So I can change it when I'm 18. Every year I can change, but most people don't change. They continue. They're born to it and they die to it, like your bank. So I'm in this one. I'm coming to Israel now, and when I need to see a doctor, I open the website of this provider. Any doctor in the country that's member of this, like in a private healthcare, but I'm part of the system. So anytime I need to get any pharmacy things, anytime I need to do any tests, when I go to hospital, my card, I have a magnetic card. All my medical information is on this magnetic card. And when I go to a doctor in Herzliya, in Jerusalem, in Eilat, or in the north, I swipe the card and they see exactly where I was, what are the results. I can open it from here through an app. I get all my medical history there. And this medical history, which is individual, is centralized in the Ministry of Health records. So in the Ministry of Health, each one of these 4 branches of medical care are also part of the generalized system. And therefore, the Ministry of Health can monitor and see what is happening. They can tell you exactly in any given moment how many people have diabetes in the country. They can tell you how many people went to see a pediatrician today. They can tell you who needed to go, who is above the age of 80 and has risk factors, centralized, and which is an extraordinary thing because let's say in Germany, there's a fantastic public healthcare system, but it's not unified. Therefore, you go to, like in America, you go to your personal doctor, he has your records, but when you go to another doctor, you need to tell him your personal records.
But the question is for this vaccine,
Yes.
for this vaccine, did I get if I'm an Israeli citizen, did I get a call from my doctor? Did I get a call?
No, not from your doctor. You got a call from the provider.
And that, so there was no waiting in line. You got a call, say, show up at such and such a time.
No,
that's
so you could.
Go ahead.
What happened was they gave you the age groups. They started giving the Ministry of Health guidelines, said people above the age of 70 can start now. And then you go to your provider, you get in the website, you try and you schedule the first vaccination and the second. You go to one of the centers close to your home, you get it. For instance, my father's 78. He didn't register, he didn't go online, but he went without a line. Within 4 minutes, he got the vaccine. My mother, the same, a week after came because she was in the age group. But the rest,
there is discussion in this country about either training additional people or bringing in the military because there's a shortage of people to administer the shots. Did Israel have enough personnel, enough equipment, enough PPE and everything else to take care of all of its population?
So yes, they were completely ready. They didn't need any extra help from the army in this case or the other wings. What they did was they rehired retired nurses and people who were also in the army service. They used to do these things connected to medical. They were paramedics. So they asked them to come like for reservist service and they came and helped, but it was not officially taking the army. It was still run by these medical institutions, some of the hospitals also.
Okay. What arrangements have been made for people who live in Gaza or the West Bank?
So as this is important to understand because I'm getting quite a lot of questions about this topic recently. According to the Oslo agreements from the 90s, official agreements that were signed by Israel and the Palestinian Authority, Israel is not responsible for the healthcare of the Palestinian population, and this is solely the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority as part of their autonomy. This is something that they would like to have. They wanted to administer their autonomy in the field of medical care. They didn't want to get guidance, nor support, nor pressure, or anything connected to Israel vis-a-vis healthcare. So this is in routine, and this is true also during COVID. This is the basic line. These are the agreements amongst that.
Daniel,
yes.
Nothing about this is routine. Nothing.
Nothing. Correct.
So to point back to the Oslo agreements, I guess I can't imagine. I mean, Israel, has control over those areas, and the question is, can Israel ever be safe? Safe from COVID if folks, Palestinians, don't get immunized. There is interaction. People walk across the borders. There's back and forth. Seems to me, if I'm living in Chicago and people in Skokie, none of them are immunized, I'm in trouble. So explain to me the thinking of leaving the Palestinians to fend for themselves.
No, but I didn't say that. I wanted to get to the second part. This is what I'm saying in routine, and this is what the law says. This is what the agreements, the bilateral agreements say. Nevertheless, as you mentioned, Shelley, correctly, first and foremost, this is an Israeli interest that all of them will be safe, will be healthy, because we are living together, we are working together. They come in and out, working from both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. That's on the practical level for Israelis. And then on the humanitarian level, it's a humanistic interest. We would like them to be safe. We don't want to see anyone die, God forbid, or get, and Israel treated many people coming in throughout the pandemic who had more complicated complications with COVID, so Israel treated them in Israeli hospitals as well. So practically, as for what is happening now, the Palestinian Authority, until very recently, did not talk to Israel at all since the Trump plan, peace plan. They cut relationship with Israel until November, when it resumed. And therefore, they didn't have any interaction. Nevertheless, Israel helped them with trainings, daily trainings of medical teams came to the West Bank to train them how to treat COVID. They helped them with how to treat it, but also how to protect the medical teams and more. So the army sent help, and the medical teams from Israel, the Ministry of Health sent them there. And then when they showed interest in acquiring vaccinations, they're in process of talking with Russia about the Sputnik vaccinations. They were never interested in the Pfizer or Moderna. They have their own reasons, maybe because of their relationship with Russia. They want to get that, and the World Health Organization, they're part of their program, and therefore there's a special program for economies that are more needy, and then they get it in different ways. Nevertheless, Israel is going to vaccinate Palestinian prisoners in Israel very soon, according to the Minister of Health. And Israel, of course, will help facilitate when they are bringing it in. We'll help in any way we can throughout the borders and more. So it's Israel's interest to have the Palestinian people safe, secure, and healthy, hopefully living peacefully next to us. So there's no reason for us not to help, but this is really for practical reasons. They never reached out, and when they did reach out, it was to facilitate them bringing in the Russian vaccinations.
Has Israel offered assistance?
Israel, as I mentioned before, offered assistance in many of the fields.
Has Israel offered some of its vaccinations?
Currently not. They were never requested, and therefore Israel said that when it will be discussed, when they will get requests, they will consider it. But until now, they never asked for it.
And so what percentage of the Palestinian population is vaccinated?
Still, they didn't get it yet. They're in the end of the process of purchasing it from Russia.
So the answer is zero.
I don't know if zero. I don't have the numbers.
But very low.
I'm sure it's not zero, because I'm sure there are people who acquired in different places, but the exact statistic I don't have currently.
So the question is this: can Israel be safe from COVID if Palestinians lag so significantly behind in vaccinations?
So we need to differentiate between what's happening in Gaza. Currently, there's a lockdown. So there's the people entering and leaving are monitored. The ones who are coming to work are mostly tested, trying to get tested as much as possible. In the Gaza Strip, it's mostly closed. So this is a humanitarian issue of the Gaza Strip, and it's less connected to people coming in and out of Israel. It's more connected to the West Bank, where it's more close. We are living closer to each other. People are going in and out. And of course, in healthcare, the virus doesn't differentiate between gender, religion, race. It can come to anyone. And whenever anything connected to healthcare, this is both our issues. So the other side, we are responsible for ourselves. We're responsible for our neighbors. They're responsible for themselves and for us on a humanitarian basis. I'm differentiating between humanitarian and legal. So legally, according to international law, Israel is not responsible. Of course, on the humanitarian level, we care, and we want our neighbors to live safely and healthy next to us.
So let me ask the question one more time.
Please.
Can Israel ever be safe if Palestinians, whether on the West Bank or in Gaza, do not get vaccinated in a timely fashion?
This is a tough question. This is a question for medical teams. I mean, of course, I would hope that everyone will be vaccinated throughout all the region. The more a tourist can come to Israel, and if he's not vaccinated, he could also bring a mutation, and then the rest of the population could get a new mutation. So, of course, those who live closer to us, it's our primary interest that they will be vaccinated also not to bring in new mutations to Israel. And of course, we don't want the population to get new. So, of course, it's an Israeli interest that the Palestinian will get vaccinated. Whether we can be safe without that, probably the answer is yes, because people till the age of 16 are also not getting vaccinated. And if the majority of the people at risk will be vaccinated, they should be safe. But this doesn't mean that we want to see people suffering and having difficulties, medical difficulties. But I'll say another thing, that if COVID is also not spreading around them, and the Israelis are not spreading it also there. There's also Israelis who are traveling, Arab Israelis who are traveling to the West Bank, and there are also those who are living in the West Bank, Israeli or Jews, and they also live together. So it's both directions. You need all sides to be vaccinated, all sides protected in order to live together next to each other in health and secure.
So one of our participants is more knowledgeable than I am, which is not surprising. And this person says that the Palestinians have in fact asked Israel for vaccine through the WHO, but that Israel has refused. Is that not accurate?
So I didn't understand whether they asked Israel or the WHO.
Palestinians have asked Israel for vaccine through the WHO, but that Israel has refused. That's what it says. That's what this person asked. Another person says that Israel, because it's responsible for, would argue that Israel is responsible for vaccinating Palestinians because of the blockade, and this would promote respect and peace if they would help out. I mean, it seems, I mean, I understand you're a diplomat, and I understand you represent the country, and I don't represent anybody, but it seems to me it's pretty evident that if your neighbor is at risk, that puts you at risk. And, you know, we're not talking about, you know, fighting and war and stuff. We're talking about health. And the sooner you can get Palestinians up to that adequate vaccination level, because they're very poor. For whatever reason, they're very poor. And Israel is a fairly affluent country by comparison. And so if the government's position is let the Palestinians do it by themselves, that seems like that's counterproductive for Israel, because that puts you at risk.
So
I would think.
Yeah, please.
No, go ahead.
I would like to take that question into two parts, because there were two parts of the question. The one part, we need to differentiate between the legal responsibility, moral responsibility, and humanitarian will to assist. First and foremost, as a person, as a human being, I would like my Palestinian neighbor to be safe, secure, as much as my son and my daughter Ella here. They're important. The Palestinian neighbor is not less important than my daughter Ella to me as a human being. And it's the truth. And I'm not saying it as lip service. It's the truth. It's my neighbor. I've been many times there. I have a lot of friends of mine. I have people who I know very well. And it's not connected the way, even if I wouldn't have known them, they are my neighbors and I have a moral responsibility as a human being. That's number one. If we are talking about the legal responsibilities, because we are talking about eventually the international arena is built on legalities, even if we like it or not, even if we like sometimes to take our glasses off and look at it only in a moral perspective, we're looking at a legal perspective. The Oslo Accords are what binds the relationship between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. And the Oslo Accords show in the most clear way that the responsibility is on the Palestinian Authority for anything connected to that. And I can say an example, if let's say you'd see on the Mexican border, Mexicans having COVID along the border, and they're much less wealthy than those in the American side. Is it a United States responsibility by law to provide them vaccinations, or whether it's a moral responsibility? That's a discussion. It's a philosophical discussion, but we need to...
Daniel, with all due, and I don't want, the idea for this conversation was not to get consumed with the Palestinian question, but I think it's preposterous to compare the US and any of our neighbors to Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank in Gaza. Those are not comparable at all. The US doesn't have troops, doesn't enforce things, doesn't, you know, so that's just not, I mean, that's
no, I'm not comparing at all, Shelley. So if you got it as a comparison, I'm not comparing the situation between America and Mexico at all. I just gave an example of if you have a border country, and if I'm not comparing, I'm not saying it's similar, I'm just saying that when we are talking about the legal versus a moral responsibility, we have to differentiate between the two. And also, if we're looking at the Gaza Strip versus the West Bank, these are also two different stories. A lot of people put them in one space, but it's two different stories. And you asked before about the blockade. So Israel never ever blocked support, humanitarian and medical support in the Gaza Strip, including in military operations when we needed to get in. Still, medical supplies came through the Israeli checkposts there throughout the time in many, many trucks bringing in supplies. So this is something that Israel has never, the responsibility for the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, Hamas is leading there. Hamas is a hostile entity to Israel. The Palestinian Authority is a partner for discussions to Israel. So we are talking about two different things here, even though it's the same, the Palestinians are the same Palestinian people, those who live in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, but we are talking about two different matters here. So there are the challenges of the Gaza Strip, of course, living in one of the most dense places in the world, very, very poor. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. It's a true tragedy, and I really hope the situation will improve. Nevertheless, claiming that Israel needs to give the people in the Gaza Strip or are obliged to give the people who are controlling and do not recognize the state of Israel, its existence, and shoot rockets at the state of Israel is a different matter than discussing with the Palestinian Authority, who are partners for discussion, what to do and how to facilitate it better, and sending, as I mentioned before, sending forces, army forces to help the paramedics there, and sending doctors on a daily basis to Palestinian hospitals and doctors and teaching them how to cope with COVID based on the Israeli know-how. And of course, treating Palestinians who needed more sophisticated medical care in Israel.
Okay, changing gears for a moment, is there a timetable for when Israel will vaccinate all the folks in Israel and they'll all be covered with vaccine?
Hopefully, of course, this is only, we hope. We never know because we don't know the pace. If the different population, the younger population who want to have it, let's say the 35-year-olds will come less than the 80-year-old. We don't really know, but we expect the population, the majority, the vast majority by the end of March to be completely vaccinated.
By the end of March, that's terrific.
That's the hope.
And what's the process after that?
What is the process after, or what is the continuation?
Yeah.
What is the continuation? So the process, what is expected, this is again the plan, this is theory. We hope that theory will be as planned. We know we sometimes do plans and God laughs, but we hopefully, what it's supposed to be is getting into March. By the end of March, the vast majority of the population will be vaccinated, besides the people under the age of 16. It might change if the FDA approves also vaccinations under that age. After that, we'll start beginning with the exit strategy. But these things, they were discussed, but then they were halted because we still can't discuss about the end. We are still in the midst of the pandemic. So
you follow the US FDA guidelines in that regard?
Yes, the FDA and the European guidelines. If the FDA, because it's the most strict, when the FDA approves, we approve it as well. If the FDA doesn't approve, we don't approve.
And is Israel getting both Moderna and Pfizer?
Yes, Israel started getting Moderna very slowly recently. Pfizer, we already have very large amounts. We have weekly shipments of Pfizer. Moderna will enhance it in February, March, but we have Pfizer coming on a weekly basis.
No shortage of vaccines? No
shortage of vaccines.
And what about, I think the third one, is it the third Johnson & Johnson, I think, is the third
There's
one?
AstraZeneca in Great Britain, but we are currently we don't have agreements with them. We are currently working with Pfizer and Moderna.
So there's no plan to get it from any other provider?
It could be in the future, but currently we have sufficient amount. And what is most important for us is also the self capacity of Israel to produce vaccinations by itself. So this is something we have a center in Israel that is producing. It's now in the third stage of between the second and third stage of the process. Hopefully we'll be able, and this will be dramatic for a small country like Israel, to have the capacity. This is a dream, this is a vision, to have self-sufficiency in making vaccinations. So not duplicating and not machines, or not taking the technology of someone else, but the technology is unique Israeli technology. This is a game changer, but we are still not there, but we hope it will help.
And is there any indication of how much the vaccine has prevented infections, particularly from the new variants?
So what they say, these are initial, because everything is happening so quickly. Initially, and this is happening, they're still not peer-reviewed research, but they claim that the British variant, which is the most popular today in Israel, and I think most of the world in the new mutation, is effective. The vaccination is supposed to be effective. The other one, which is the South African, it's clear that it helps, not clear how much it helps, but it's supposed to be good enough, they say. They don't have enough numbers and information. The Brazilian variant has not been checked yet, and the rest also not. But there are about 3,000 mutations in the world. So we're talking about the most popular ones, if you call them popular, but this is the current situation.
And I know Israel paid a premium, $60 a vaccine, or much more than the US. Has there been any discussion in Israel politics about the cost of the program, or any hesitation about spending that much more than the rest of the world, or is that embraced by the political class?
So as I said before, because of non-disclosure agreements, so no one in the world knows how much anyone else paid. So it's never public because this is the strict agreements of these companies. So you will not know in America how much they paid. In Europe, none of the countries, even the most open and transparent.
Daniel, I just know what I read in the New York Times. So the New York Times has about $50 or $60 a shot. So
no, but I'm saying from what I've read also is that Israel paid higher amounts than the rest because they also joined in the end. So but nevertheless, the question here, and I think this is the most important part here, this was in public discourse. I heard in the morning news in Israel, the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Health were asked by a very, very critical journalist, asked them, tell me, how much did you spend? You spent this and this amount. It's a lot of money and it comes from our taxpayers' money. We are entitled to know how much we spent. And the answer they gave, which I think is a rather interesting and correct answer, even if we paid $100 per shot, the amount that it saves for the economy for the long run is worth, even if we pay a few $1 million more, one day of closure is billions of shekels. So all of these things together, the closures, the economy that is not moving, so whatever price it is, Israeli society is willing to pay. That's what public opinion says. They say, just give it to us. We want to finish this thing. And doesn't matter for us if they paid $60, $50, eventually 9 million people. It's peanuts compared to the price that the Israeli economy is paying for more and more of COVID.
Daniel, I agree with you, but I just was wondering if in politics, sometimes there's other sides. So tell us what impact COVID has had on the Israeli economy. Obviously, tourism and other things. You've been here for 6 months. You see what's happened in the U.S. Has it had a similar impact in Israel?
So, fortunately, Israeli economy is not totally dependent on tourism, and only about 7% of the GDP comes from tourism, which is a very important aspect because countries that are mostly tourism got very, very hard economic problems due to COVID. Israeli economy, what saved us, so-called, is the fact that a lot of the production of a lot of the GDP comes from startup companies and high-tech sectors. And they love computers. I don't need to tell you, the startups live Zoom. They found Zoom many years before we've heard of Zoom. So because of that, they could continue working. So the remote work continued, and therefore they never closed. And therefore this led Israel, of course, we're in deficits, and the deficit is getting harder and harder, and the situation is grim. We have 800,000 people who are unemployed. We have people who are on leave. We have many, many problems caused from this pandemic, and we hopefully will get out of it in the near future. Nevertheless, most of the problems happened in the lower class workers because they closed down. Let's say when they closed the hotels, so most of the hotel workers are earning lower salaries. But this actually helped the economy on a global level, not on the individual level. It's a tragedy. Each person who loses a job is a tragedy for him and his family. But for the economy, they gave social benefits. The government gave them unemployment rates, but because they were the lowest paid workers, for the government, paying unemployment rates for the lowest rates saves a lot of money, rather than if the higher people getting higher salaries would get unemployed, then they needed to pay much more money on the government level. Therefore, it's a bit balanced itself, but still, Israel is in big deficits as well.
So in that case, in that situation, it's similar to what we know in the US, but obviously there was a political battle here about how much to give folks who were put out of jobs, who are the lower wage workers, as you say. Do you know how much those workers in Israel got from the government to tide them over until they could get back to work?
So what they did was they said a few months ago already, they already claimed that until June this year, they have a safety net and they'll get unemployment benefits until then, regardless of what happens. COVID ends, doesn't end. June is to give you time and opportunity to breathe and say, we're going to pass this time. This is on the individual, on those individuals who lost their job or were put on to pay unpaid leave or these kind of things. Parallel to that, those who are independent and they just have they are in the private sector and they needed to close their businesses, they get compensated based on their business and the loss. If they lost more than 20%, they get compensated by the size of the business, by the amount that they lost, by many different things. And there were also a few times that all the population received, like happened here with in America, a check in the mail, so-called. We didn't get a check in the mail, we got it to our bank accounts, but there was 3 times that happened. Nevertheless, there are those who claim that it's not enough, there are those who claim it's fine, and there are those who claim, when criticized, that not enough was given into developing new skills for the employees, because unfortunately, and I'm saying it from common sense, not from economical knowledge, that a lot of these people will not come back to their jobs because some of the jobs will not be anymore. We are living the revolution now. I don't think in history there was such a quick revolution that in one day you need to close everything, and in wars, in World War II, the economies were mobilized into the war. This is the first time in history that the world is telling the world to stop economies. Never has it happened before, and therefore I really don't know how the world will get out of it. I really hope quickly and easily, but I have no clue.
We only have a few more moments left. I know in the last couple of years, the Israeli government has been in several elections, and unfortunately governments rise and fall. Is the handling of COVID going to be an issue in the coming elections? Or has it?
Definitely. The most interesting fact is that now it's going to be the first time in Israeli history that the elections will be on the question of economy. This may sound funny for an American viewer or listener. In Israel, the elections are never about economy. Even though there are parties who come and say economy, 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 stupid, it doesn't work. The elections in Israel are right, left, the Palestinian question always were. And now it's going to be, and this is according to polls all over, according to how are you going to treat economy during COVID? And the more the vaccinations will succeed, the more the economy will open by the elections, the higher the chances of the current government or the Likud party to gain points. The more we are in lockdowns and there's no future, the more chances that other parties have. So it's going to be a balance between that. It's an equation. The more COVID, the less good for the current government, and the opposite.
Have you been vaccinated in the US?
Unfortunately, not yet. We're working on it.
You need to be older. It's not so easy in the US.
No.
If you were home in Israel, you'd be vaccinated by now.
Still not, but I'm too young for that also. Shelly, you are complimenting me. I'm 32. I still have time. Not in the 35 threshold yet.
You're a baby.
Baby, yeah.
Well, I think our time is just about up. And I very much appreciate your time and Rennie taking and setting this up, and Sue Katz making the invitation. This has been very enlightening, and I've enjoyed it mostly, and hopefully you've enjoyed the exchange. you've been great. And we wish our friends in Israel nothing but the best, and hopefully you can get to 100% and get everybody vaccinated and healthy, and we get back on with our lives.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much for having me, Shelley. It was very interesting, exciting, and I hope to see you come to Israel in normal days and that you get vaccinated as soon as possible. Stay healthy, warm, and safe with your families. And also,
It's on the bucket list.
okay, that's #1 priority. Thank you very much.
Angela?
All right. On behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, thank you, Daniel. This was a very lively discussion. I think the chat was equally lively. So thank you all for sharing your views in the chat as well as asking good questions. For those of you who are not yet members of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, please become a member. We hold these kinds of discussions bi-monthly and a variety of other programs. Tomorrow we will be speaking with the Japanese Consul General, Mr. Kenichi Okada. And so I invite you all to join us at 11 a.m. tomorrow for that discussion.